The crystal glass trembled against my lips as Grandpa pressed it closer, his weathered fingers surprisingly firm against my jaw. "For your nerves, my little songbird," he murmured. But something in his voice had changed, a roughness I'd never heard before, like gravel scraping against silk. The liquid inside was amber-colored sweet with honey, but carrying an underlying bitterness that made my throat constrict. I should have trusted my instincts. I should have pulled away. Instead, I smiled and drank because this was Grandpa, my protector, my champion, the man who had called me his little songbird since I could barely walk. But as the warmth spread through my chest and into my limbs, I caught something in his eyes that made my blood turn cold. It wasn't the familiar twinkle of grandfatherly affection I'd known for 18 years. It was hunger, raw, predatory hunger, that transformed his beloved face into something monstrous. In that moment, fragments of memory crashed together like broken glass. The way his hands had lingered too long on my shoulders during piano lessons. How he'd insisted on helping me dress for church when I was 15, the strange intensity in his gaze when he watched me sing. All those moments I'd dismissed as harmless eccentricity now revealed themselves as something far more sinister. "There's my good girl," he said, steadying me as my knees began to buckle. "Just like your grandmother was." The words hit me like ice water, carrying implications I was too naive to fully understand, but terrified enough to recognize as wrong. The reception continued around us. My wedding reception, the celebration of my marriage to James Mitchell, the most beautiful day of my life. But I was already disappearing into a nightmare that would haunt me for decades to come. My name is Eleanor Worthington Mitchell, and this is the story of how I learned that monsters don't always hide in shadows. Sometimes they sit at the head of your dinner table blessing your food with hands that have committed unspeakable sins. Sometimes they walk you down the aisle with pride in their eyes and poison in their pockets. Sometimes they are the very people the world tells you to trust most. The morning of June 18, 1955, had dawned bright and clear over Harmony Creek, Ohio. Our small town of 2847 souls nestled in rolling farmland, where everyone knew everyone else's business or thought they did. I was Eleanor Marie Worthington, then 18 years old, and trembling with excitement as my mother Catherine helped me into my wedding dress in the upstairs bedroom of our colonial house on Elm Street. "Ah, hold still, darling," Mother said, her voice soft with emotion as she fastened the tiny pearl buttons that ran up my spine. "You look absolutely radiant. James is the luckiest man alive." The dress was everything I had dreamed of: ivory silk, with delicate lace sleeves, and a train that whispered against the hardwood floor as I moved. The seed pearls had been Grandpa's idea, sewn on by the finest seamstress in Columbus. Nothing but the best for my little songbird's wedding day, he had declared, and I had glowed under his approval the way I always did. James Mitchell had been courting me for 2 years with the patience and persistence of a man who knew what he wanted. At 24, he was everything a young woman in 1955 could hope for: tall and strong from working at his family's lumber mill, kind-eyed behind wire-rimmed glasses, with a gentle manner that made me feel cherished rather than possessed. He wrote for the Harmony Creek Gazette in his spare time, filling his articles with the kind of passionate idealism that made my heart race. When he looked at me, I felt like I could be more than just another banker's daughter, destined for a life of quiet domesticity. "I love you, Eleanor Worthington," he had said the night he proposed, kneeling in my father's rose garden under a canopy of stars. "I love your voice when you sing, your laugh when something delights you, the way you see possibility in everything. Marry me, and I promise you'll never be just another pretty decoration on someone else's life. You'll be my partner, my equal, my heart." My father, Robert Worthington, had given his blessing readily enough. As president of Farmers and Merchants Bank, he valued stability and reputation above all else, and James came from a respectable family with no scandals or debts to their name. My mother had been quietly pleased. She genuinely liked James, and trusted his intentions toward me. But it was Grandpa's enthusiastic approval that had sealed the matter. Colonel Theodore Worthington was the undisputed patriarch of our family, and by extension, much of Harmony Creek's social hierarchy. At 72, he remained an imposing figure, despite his age, silver-haired and straight-backed, with piercing blue eyes that seemed to see straight through to your soul. He had served with distinction in the Great War, returning with medals and stories that made him a local legend. For 37 years since my grandmother's death, he had lived alone in the big Victorian house on the hill overlooking Main Street, managing his considerable investments and serving on every important board and committee in town. "That young man has character," Grandpa had pronounced after James formally asked for my hand. "He'll take good care of our little songbird. You have my blessing, and more importantly, you have my respect, James Mitchell." The ceremony at St. Mary's Cathedral was everything a young bride could want. The church was packed with familiar faces, neighbors, family friends, my father's business associates, my mother's bridge club, and what seemed like half the town. Sunlight streamed through the stained glass windows, casting rainbow patterns across the white roses and baby's breath that adorned every pew. The organ music soared to the rafters as I walked down the aisle on my father's arm, my heart so full of joy I thought it might burst. James stood at the altar, looking handsome and nervous in his black suit, his eyes never leaving my face. When Father McKenna asked who gave this woman to be married to this man, my father's voice rang out clear and proud. "Her mother and I do with the blessing of her grandfather, Colonel Theodore Worthington." Our vows were traditional but heartfelt. When James slipped the gold band onto my finger, his hands were steady despite the emotion in his voice. "With this ring I thee wed. With my body I thee worship. With all my worldly goods I thee endow." My own voice barely trembled as I repeated the sacred words that would bind us together for life. The kiss that sealed our marriage was sweet and brief, appropriate for the setting, but full of promise for our future together. As we turned to face our family and friends as husband and wife, the organ burst into Mendelssohn's Wedding March, and I caught sight of Grandpa in the front pew. He was beaming with pride, dabbing at his eyes with a handkerchief, looking every inch the devoted grandfather, watching his beloved girl begin her new life. I should have noticed the way his gaze lingered on my face, my figure in the wedding dress he had insisted on paying for. I should have questioned why he had been so involved in every detail of the wedding planning, from the flowers to the menu to the specific vintage of champagne he wanted served. I should have wondered why he had insisted that the reception include a private library where he could have a quiet word with special guests away from the crowd. But I was 18 and in love and dizzy with the joy of my wedding day. I saw only what I wanted to see: a grandfather's love and pride in his granddaughter's happiness. The reception at Harmony Creek Country Club was elegant beyond my wildest dreams. The ballroom sparkled with crystal chandeliers and white linen, the tables adorned with roses from my mother's prize-winning garden. Grandpa had spared no expense hiring musicians from Cincinnati and serving champagne that he claimed to have been saving since before the war. The whole town seemed to be there, dressed in their finest clothes and eager to celebrate the union of two of Harmony Creek's most prominent families. "Mrs. Mitchell," James whispered in my ear during our first dance as husband and wife. "How does it feel to have a new name?" "Perfect," I whispered back, meaning it with every fiber of my being. "Mrs. Eleanor Mitchell. I like the sound of that." He spun me around the dance floor with surprising grace for a man who worked with his hands, and I felt like I was floating on air. The other couples joined us gradually, my parents looking dignified and proper, James's parents glowing with happiness, aunts and uncles and family friends all swept up in the joy of the occasion. "Save a dance for your old grandfather," came a familiar voice beside us, and I turned to see Grandpa approaching with that indulgent smile I knew so well. He was impeccably dressed in his finest suit, his war medals gleaming on his chest, looking every inch the distinguished gentleman that Harmony Creek Society revered. "Of course, Grandpa," I said, stepping into his arms as James gallantly surrendered his bride for the traditional grandfather-granddaughter dance. Thank you for everything, the dress, the reception, all of it. You've made this the most beautiful day of my life. Nothing is too good for my little songbird, he replied, guiding me smoothly across the floor. His dancing was as polished as everything else about him, a skill learned in the elegant ballrooms of Europe during his military service. You look absolutely radiant, my dear. Absolutely perfect. There was something in his tone that made me glance up at his face, and for just a moment, I caught something strange in his expression. His eyes seemed to be memorizing every detail of my appearance, the way the silk dress clung to my figure, the flush of excitement in my cheeks, the happy sparkle in my eyes. It was more intense than grandfatherly pride, more possessive than simple affection. But before I could analyze it further, his expression returned to normal, and I dismissed the momentary unease as wedding day nerves. I have something special for you, he murmured as the music came to an end. A little toast to celebrate your new life. It's a family tradition. My own grandmother served it to me on my wedding day, and my father before that. Come with me to the library when you have a moment. It's more private there, more appropriate for family ceremony. The mention of family tradition warmed my heart. The Worthingtons were proud of their heritage, their deep roots in Harmony Creek society, their reputation for honor and respectability. If there was a special tradition to mark my transition from granddaughter to married woman, I was eager to participate. I'll be there in just a few minutes, I promised, squeezing his hand affectionately. Let me just say goodbye to some of the guests who are leaving early. The next hour passed in a blur of congratulations and well wishes. Mrs. Peterson, my old Sunday school teacher, hugged me tearfully and declared that I was the most beautiful bride she'd ever seen. Mayor Whitfield made a lengthy speech about the importance of strong families to community values. The photographer posed James and me with what seemed like every possible combination of relatives and friends, the flashbulbs creating bright bursts of light that left spots dancing in my vision. By the time I made my way toward Grandpa's private library, I was beginning to feel the effects of the long day. My feet ached in their satin shoes, my face hurt from smiling, and the tight bodice of my dress was making it difficult to breathe deeply. The champagne I'd sipped throughout the reception had left me feeling slightly lightheaded, though not unpleasantly so. I was looking forward to a quiet moment with Grandpa to this special family tradition that would mark my official entrance into adult womanhood. The library was Grandpa's sanctuary at the country club, a privilege granted in recognition of his war service and generous donations. It was a masculine room lined with dark wood and leather-bound books, furnished with comfortable chairs and a massive oak desk that had belonged to the club's founder. The air smelled of tobacco and old paper familiar and comforting scents that reminded me of countless childhood visits to Grandpa's study. He was waiting for me with a crystal decanter and 2 small glasses arranged on a silver tray, clearly the special toast he had mentioned. But something about his posture struck me as different, more formal than usual, almost ceremonial in its precision. Close the door behind you, my dear, he said without turning around. This is a private family moment. We don't need interruptions. I did as he asked, the heavy oak door clicking shut with a sound that seemed unnaturally loud in the quiet room. The noise from the reception became muted and distant, as if we were suddenly isolated from the rest of the world. When Grandpa turned to face me, I was struck again by that strange intensity in his gaze, but I pushed my unease aside. This was my grandfather, the man who had loved and protected me my entire life. Sit down, Eleanor, he said, gesturing toward one of the leather chairs. Let me tell you about this tradition while I prepare our toast. I settled into the chair, arranging my wedding dress carefully around me to avoid wrinkling the silk. Grandpa moved to the sideboard where the decanter waited his movements, deliberate and practiced. As he poured the amber liquid into the glasses, he began to speak in a voice that was softer than usual, almost hypnotic. The Worthington women have always been special, he said, his back still turned to me. beautiful, refined bred for grace and elegance. Your grandmother was the most beautiful woman in 3 counties when I married her. Your mother was lovely too in her quiet way. But you, Eleanor. He paused, lifting one of the glasses to examine its contents in the lamplight. You surpass them all. You're the culmination of everything the Worthington bloodline was meant to produce. There was something unsettling about his words, a possessiveness that made my skin crawl, despite the warmth of the room. When he turned around, carrying the 2 glasses, I noticed that his hands were trembling slightly, not with age, but with some kind of excitement or anticipation that sent warning signals racing through my nervous system. This toast has been shared by Worthington brides for generations. He continued, approaching my chair with measured steps. It's made from a special recipe handed down from mother to daughter, grandmother to granddaughter. It represents the wisdom of experience, the blessing of family, the preparation for married life. He held out one of the glasses, and I could see that the liquid inside was indeed amber-colored, with an oily consistency that caught the light strangely. There was a sweet smell rising from it, honey and spices. But underneath lurked something bitter and medicinal that made my stomach clench with instinctive revulsion. I don't know, Grandpa, I said hesitantly, making no move to take the glass. I've already had champagne and I'm feeling a little dizzy. Maybe we should wait until— Nonsense! He interrupted, his voice taking on a sharp edge I'd never heard before. This is tradition, Eleanor. Your grandmother drank this toast, as did her grandmother before her. You wouldn't want to break a family tradition on your wedding day, would you? The pressure in his voice was unmistakable, though still couched in terms of family duty and respect for heritage. I had been raised to obey my elders, to honor family traditions, to never cause embarrassment or scandal by questioning established customs. Despite my growing unease, I reached out and accepted the glass, its crystal surface cold against my palm. That's my good girl, Grandpa said, settling into the chair across from me with his own glass. Now let's drink to your future happiness, to the continuation of Worthington excellence, and to the special bond between grandfather and granddaughter that nothing can ever break. He raised his glass in a formal toast, and social conditioning overrode my instincts. I lifted my own glass and took a sip of the mysterious liquid, fighting not to gag, as the bitter aftertaste burned my throat. Almost immediately, I felt a strange warmth spreading through my chest, different from the pleasant buzz of champagne. This was heavier, more invasive, like thick syrup flowing through my veins. Finish it, my dear, Grandpa encouraged, his eyes never leaving my face. All of it. That's the tradition. Every drop must be consumed to ensure the blessing takes hold. My hand was already beginning to feel heavy and uncoordinated, but I obediently drained the glass each swallow, more difficult than the last. The room seemed to be growing warmer, the air thicker, the sounds from the reception increasingly distant and distorted. When I tried to set the empty glass on the side table, my fingers fumbled and it nearly slipped from my grasp. Grandpa, I whispered, my voice sounding strange and slurred even to my own ears. I don't feel right. Something's wrong. But when I looked at his face, I saw no concern or alarm in his features. Instead, I saw satisfaction, the cold, calculating satisfaction of a hunter who had successfully trapped his prey. The grandfatherly mask he had worn my entire life was slipping away, revealing something monstrous underneath. There's nothing wrong, my little songbird, he said, rising from his chair and moving toward me with predatory grace. Everything is going exactly according to plan. Terror crashed over me like ice water as I realized the horrifying truth. The special family tradition, the private ceremony, the amber liquid that was now coursing through my system like liquid fire, none of it was what he had claimed. I was trapped, helpless, at the mercy of a man I had trusted implicitly my entire life. The drug, for that's what it obviously was, had already begun its work, turning my limbs to lead and my voice to a whisper. "Please!" I managed to gasp, trying to push myself up from the chair, but my legs wouldn't support my weight. The wedding dress that had made me feel like a princess now seemed to weigh 1,000 pounds, the silk and lace transformed into a prison of fabric. "Grandpa, please don't do this." "Shh, my dear child," he murmured, kneeling beside my chair with a gentleness that was more terrifying than any violence could have been. "Don't fight it. The medicine will work better if you don't struggle against it. I know what's best for you. I've always known what's best for my little songbird." His hands were on my shoulders now, and I could smell the familiar scents of his cologne and pipe tobacco odors that had always meant safety and comfort, but now filled me with revulsion. Through the chemical haze clouding my thoughts, fragments of memory began to surface, moments I had dismissed or forgotten, warning signs I had been too innocent to recognize. I remembered being 12 and sitting on his lap while he read to me, the way his hands had wandered to places they shouldn't have touched, the way he had explained it as natural affection when I tried to squirm away. I remembered being 15 and helping him in his study, the way he had insisted on adjusting my dress himself, his fingers lingering far longer than necessary on the buttons and ties. I remembered countless times when he had watched me sing at church or school performances, his gaze more intense than simple pride should warrant. All those moments crystallized into a pattern of predatory behavior that I had been too trusting, too naive, too thoroughly indoctrinated into respecting my elders to recognize. He had been grooming me for years, preparing me for this moment when I would be completely vulnerable and utterly at his mercy. "Your grandmother understood eventually," he continued, his voice taking on a dreamy, nostalgic quality that made my blood run cold. "She fought at first, of course, they all do initially, but she learned to accept her place, to fulfill her duties as a Worthington woman should. Just as you will learn, my dear. Just as you must learn." The implications of his words hit me like physical blows. My grandmother, the gentle woman I remembered from my early childhood, had endured this same horror. The official story was that she had died of a weak heart, but now I wondered what other secrets were buried in the Worthington family history. How many women had suffered in silence to preserve the reputation of this monster who masqueraded as a war hero and pillar of the community? I tried to scream, to call for help, to alert someone, anyone, to what was happening in this room. But the drug had stolen my voice along with my strength, and only a pathetic whimper emerged from my throat. The sounds of the reception continued beyond the library walls, music and laughter, and the cheerful chatter of people celebrating my marriage, but I might as well have been on another planet for all the good it did me. "Sss, that's better," Grandpa said approvingly as my struggles weakened and my body went limp in the chair. "Fighting only makes it more difficult for everyone involved. Now let me help you to the sofa where you'll be more comfortable for our special time together." He lifted me easily, despite his age, carrying me across the room with the same care he might have shown a sick child. The leather sofa was soft and familiar. I had sat on it countless times during family gatherings, reading books or listening to adult conversations. Now it was to be the site of my violation, the place where my innocence would be destroyed by the man who was supposed to protect it. As he laid me down on the cushions, arranging my wedding dress with meticulous attention to detail, I caught sight of a silver-framed photograph on the nearby bookshelf. It showed Grandpa in his military uniform standing beside a young woman in a white dress, my grandmother, on their wedding day in 1918. She looked radiant and hopeful, just as I had looked a few hours earlier, completely unaware of the horror that awaited her. The parallel was so grotesque, so calculated, that I understood with crystal clarity that this was no impulsive act born of opportunity and weakness. This was a deliberate pattern, a family tradition far more sinister than any he had claimed. He had been planning this moment since my childhood, waiting for my wedding day to claim what he considered his right as patriarch of the Worthington family. "Don't look so frightened, my little songbird." He whispered, his breath hot against my ear as he leaned over me. "This is natural proper, the way things have always been done in our family. Your grandmother learned to enjoy our special times together, and so will you. I'm going to teach you everything you need to know about being a proper Worthington wife." Through the haze of drugs and terror, one thought burned bright and clear in my mind, James. My husband of just a few hours was somewhere in this building, probably wondering where his bride had disappeared, to possibly beginning to worry about my prolonged absence. If there was any hope of rescue, any chance of escape from this nightmare, it lay with the man who had promised to love and protect me for the rest of our lives. But as Grandpa's hands began their violation of my body, as he whispered endearments that turned my stomach, and promises that filled me with despair, that hope seemed as distant and unreachable as the stars outside the library windows. Time became meaningless in that room of horrors. Minutes stretched into hours, or perhaps hours compressed into moments. I had no way of measuring the passage of time while trapped in my chemically induced paralysis. The sounds of the reception continued beyond the walls, growing gradually softer as guests began to leave, and the celebration wound down, but no one came looking for the missing bride. Grandpa took his time with his assault, clearly savoring both my helplessness and his complete control over the situation. He spoke to me throughout the ordeal in that same gentle grandfatherly tone I had known all my life, as if he were still reading me bedtime stories or helping me with difficult arithmetic. The cognitive dissonance was almost as devastating as the physical violation. This monster, wearing my grandfather's face, committing unspeakable acts, while using the voice of love and protection. "You're being so good, my dear," he murmured, pausing in his ministrations to stroke my hair with hands that trembled slightly with age and exertion. "So much better than I expected for your first time. Your grandmother was more difficult initially, but you have a natural grace, a natural understanding of your place in the family hierarchy." Through the fog of drugs and trauma, I began to understand the full scope of his depravity. This wasn't simply about sexual gratification, though. That was certainly part of it. This was about power, about ownership, about his belief that as patriarch of the Worthington family, he had the right to claim any woman who bore his name. In his twisted worldview, my wedding day wasn't the beginning of my independence as a married woman, but rather the ceremony that formally delivered me into his possession. The wedding dress he had insisted on paying for, the elaborate reception he had funded, the private library he had arranged, every detail had been planned with this moment in mind. He had orchestrated my wedding day not to celebrate my happiness, but to facilitate my destruction. The thought was so monstrous, so completely at odds with everything I had believed about family and love and protection, that my mind threatened to shatter under the weight of it. But somewhere in the darkness of my despair, a spark of rage began to kindle. This man had stolen my grandmother's life, had probably destroyed countless other women over the decades, and now he was trying to claim me as his latest victim. But I wasn't just some helpless girl to be used and discarded. I was Eleanor Mitchell, now married to a man who truly loved me, connected to a world beyond Grandpa's sphere of influence. If I survived this night, if I found a way to escape his web of power and intimidation, I would make sure he paid for every crime he had ever committed. That resolve, fragile and nearly overwhelmed by trauma, but real nonetheless, became my anchor in the storm. Even as he continued his assault, even as my body betrayed me, and my voice remained trapped by chemicals, I held onto the promise I made to myself and to every woman he had hurt. This would not stand. Somehow, someway, I would find the strength to fight back. The sound of splintering wood cut through my internal vow like a blade, sharp and sudden and utterly unexpected. The library door, solid oak that had stood firm for decades, exploded inward with a crash that shook the very foundations of the building. Through the haze of drugs and trauma, I saw a familiar silhouette framed in the doorway, tall, broad-shouldered, moving with the controlled fury of a man pushed beyond all rational limits. James. His face was a masterpiece of horror and rage as he took in the scene before him. I watched his features cycle through confusion, disbelief, and then a fury so pure and incandescent that it seemed to illuminate the entire room. His wedding suit was disheveled, his tie askew, his normally neat hair wild with anxiety and exertion. He looked like he had been searching frantically, probably growing increasingly worried as my absence stretched from minutes into an hour. "Get away from her!" The roar that erupted from my husband's throat was barely human, a sound of primal protective rage that seemed to shake the very air. He launched himself across the room with frightening speed, his hands reaching for Grandpa with deadly intent. Grandpa scrambled backward, his face cycling rapidly through shock fear, and then most chillingly cold calculation. Even caught in the act, even faced with my husband's righteous fury, he was already planning his next move, already crafting the lies that might yet save him from the consequences of his actions. James reached me in 2 quick strides, his hands gentle, despite the violence he had just threatened. He stripped off his suit jacket and wrapped it around my torn wedding dress, his touch infinitely careful, as he tried to preserve what remained of my modesty and dignity. "Eleanor, oh God, Eleanor," he whispered, his voice breaking with emotion. "I'm here, sweetheart. I'm here. You're safe now. Nobody will ever hurt you again." I tried to speak, to tell him what had happened, to warn him about Grandpa's capacity for manipulation and deceit. But the drug still held my voice captive, and all I could manage was a weak sound that barely qualified as human speech. James understood immediately, his reporter's instincts and his husband's love combining to give him perfect clarity about the situation. "You bastard!" he snarled, turning toward Grandpa with murder in his eyes. "You sick, twisted bastard! She's your granddaughter. She's 18 years old. She trusted you." But our moment of connection, our brief hope for justice and protection, was shattered as the sounds of our confrontation drew others. The broken door framed a growing crowd of wedding guests drawn by the noise and commotion. My father appeared first, his face flushed with anger and embarrassment at the disturbance to his carefully orchestrated social event. My mother followed close behind, her hand pressed to her mouth in shock at the scene of destruction. Behind them came the pillars of Harmony Creek Society, Mayor Whitfield, Dr. Peterson, the bank's board members, their wives and children, and business associates. All the people whose opinion mattered in our small town, whose respect and approval determined social standing and financial success. The very last audience I would have chosen for my public humiliation and my grandfather's exposure as a monster. That's when Theodore Worthington made his move, drawing on 7 decades of experience in manipulating people and controlling narratives. "Thank God you're all here," Grandpa said, his voice perfectly controlled despite his disheveled state and the obvious evidence of what he had been doing just moments before. Eleanor collapsed during our family ceremony, too much excitement, I think, combined with the champagne. She became hysterical when she regained consciousness, started tearing at her dress and thrashing around. I was trying to calm her down when this young man burst in and attacked me. The lie was so smooth, so plausible to people who had known and trusted Theodore Worthington for decades, that I saw several members of the crowd nod in understanding. In their world, hysterical brides were common enough occurrences, young women overcome by the magnitude of marriage, prone to fits of nerves and emotional breakdowns that required masculine authority to control. "Eleanor, for God's sake, control yourself!" My father snapped, his primary concern clearly the scandal being created in front of Harmony Creek's social elite. "This is your wedding day. How dare you make such a spectacle in front of our guests?" The words hit me like physical blows, but James stepped between my father and me, his protective instincts overriding every social convention he had been taught to observe. "She didn't collapse," he said, his voice deadly quiet but carrying clearly through the shocked silence. "I know exactly what I saw. Your father was assaulting her. He drugged her and he was what?" My father interrupted, his voice rising with indignation and genuine shock. "Are you seriously suggesting that my father, a decorated war hero, a pillar of this community, would commit such an unthinkable act against his own granddaughter?" The crowd murmured with scandalized disbelief. I could see the calculation in their faces as they weighed the competing narratives. James Mitchell, an outsider, who had known the family for only 2 years, against Colonel Theodore Worthington, who had been a respected member of their community for half a century. Even disheveled and caught in a compromising position, Grandpa's word carried infinitely more weight than that of a young man they barely knew. "The girl is obviously overwrought," declared Dr. Peterson, pushing through the crowd with the authority of his medical training and his long-time friendship with Grandpa. They had served together in France, had shared foxholes, and survived gas attacks and machine gun fire. The bonds forged in warfare were not easily broken by accusations from hysterical brides and their protective husbands. Wedding day nerves complicated by alcohol. The doctor continued, his diagnosis delivered with clinical certainty. "I've seen it dozens of times. The best treatment is rest and quiet. Let her sleep it off in familiar surroundings where she feels safe." My mother finally found her voice, though it trembled with confusion and distress. "Eleanor, darling, you're frightening everyone. What's gotten into you? Why would you say such terrible things about Grandpa?" I tried desperately to speak, to scream the truth that would shatter their comfortable delusions and expose the monster in their midst. But my voice remained trapped by the drug's effects, and only weak, incoherent sounds emerged from my throat. Each failed attempt to communicate only seemed to support their theory of hysteria and breakdown, making me appear more unstable and unreliable with every passing moment. James's face was a mask of frustrated rage as he realized the hopelessness of our situation. His word against that of a war hero and community patriarch. My drug-induced incoherence against Grandpa's calm, reasonable explanations. The social order closing ranks against justice protecting one of their own at the expense of an inconvenient truth. "She needs medical attention," James said desperately, turning to Dr. Peterson with the last hope of finding an ally. "Look at her eyes, the way she's speaking. She's been drugged. If you examine her, you'll find evidence of what really happened here." But Dr. Peterson shook his head with the patient condescension of an experienced physician dealing with an overwrought layman. "Young man, I've been practicing medicine for 30 years. I know hysteria when I see it, and I know the effects of alcohol on a young woman's constitution. Your wife needs rest, not examination. I suggest you take her home and let her recover her equilibrium in private." The crowd was already beginning to disperse, muttering among themselves about wedding day drama and the unfortunate tendency of young brides to become overwrought at crucial moments. The Worthington family reputation remained intact, while James and I were left to bear the burden of being seen as troublemakers and attention seekers who had disrupted a perfectly lovely celebration with unfounded accusations. As the library emptied and the reception wound down to its natural conclusion, Grandpa approached James and me with the same grandfatherly concern he had always shown. To anyone watching, he appeared to be nothing more than a worried elder, trying to help his traumatized granddaughter. "Take her home, son," he said quietly, placing a seemingly comforting hand on James's shoulder. "Let her rest and recover. Sometimes the magnitude of marriage can overwhelm a sensitive young woman. She'll feel better in the morning, and we can all pretend this unfortunate incident never happened." The threat beneath his kindly words was unmistakable, though disguised well enough that any casual observer would hear only grandfatherly wisdom. He was offering us a way out silence in exchange for our reputation and social standing, while simultaneously making it clear that any further accusations would result in our complete destruction within Harmony Creek society. James looked at me with anguish in his eyes, clearly torn between his desire for immediate justice and his recognition that we were completely outmatched by Grandpa's position and influence. The drug was already beginning to wear off, allowing me to nod slightly in agreement with the tactical retreat he was contemplating. We needed time to plan to gather evidence to find allies who wouldn't be swayed by Theodore Worthington's reputation and power. But as James helped me to my feet and guided me toward the door, I caught Grandpa's eye one final time. The mask had slipped just enough for me to see the satisfaction lurking beneath his concerned expression. He thought he had successfully covered his tracks and silenced his latest victim, just as he had silenced all the others. He had no idea that he had just made the mistake that would ultimately destroy him. Because James Mitchell wasn't just any young husband trying to protect his wife, he was a journalist trained to investigate, to dig for truth, to refuse to accept official stories when they didn't match the evidence. And I wasn't just another broken victim to be discarded and forgotten. I was a woman with access to resources and connections that could reach far beyond Grandpa's sphere of influence. The war hero's reign of terror was about to face its greatest challenge yet. James drove me away from that country club in silence, his jaw clenched with suppressed fury, and his hands gripping the steering wheel so tightly his knuckles showed white in the moonlight. Our honeymoon car, decorated with tin cans and just married signs that now seemed obscene, carried us through the quiet streets of Harmony Creek toward an uncertain future that bore no resemblance to the dreams we had shared just hours before. Instead of the hotel suite we had reserved for our wedding night, James took me to the Sunset Motel on the outskirts of town. It was a shabby establishment where traveling salesmen spent the night and married men conducted affairs, the kind of place where no questions were asked and discretion was assumed. Under other circumstances, I might have been hurt by the choice, but I understood his reasoning. We needed privacy, anonymity, time to process what had happened without the watchful eyes of Harmony Creek Society monitoring our every move. "Are you all right?" he asked as he helped me from the car, his voice gentle despite the rage I could see burning in his eyes. "Can you walk? Do you need me to carry you?" "I can manage," I whispered, testing my voice for the first time since the drug had begun to wear off. The words came out hoarse and shaky, but they were my own again, no longer trapped by chemical paralysis. "James, I need you to know." "What you saw?" It was exactly what it looked like. He drugged me. He... "I know, sweetheart." He set his arm steady around my waist as we walked toward the motel office. "I saw enough. You don't have to explain anything right now. We'll talk when you're ready, when you feel safe." The desk clerk barely looked up from his newspaper as James paid for a week in advance, clearly accustomed to couples who preferred not to be remembered or questioned. The room he gave us was small and basic. A narrow bed, a single chair, a bathroom with a cracked mirror, but it felt like sanctuary after the nightmare of the country club library. For the first 2 days, I was essentially catatonic. The drug had worn off completely within hours, but the trauma remained, paralyzing me more effectively than any chemical could have done. I lay on that narrow bed, staring at the water-stained ceiling, unable to eat or speak or respond to James's gentle attempts at conversation. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw Grandpa's face, felt his hands on my body, heard his voice whispering those terrible endearments that had turned love into violation. James never left my side during those dark hours. He slept in the room's single chair, bringing me water and soup that I couldn't force myself to swallow, speaking to me in soft, reassuring tones even when I couldn't respond. He didn't push for details or demand explanations. He simply stayed a constant presence that slowly began to penetrate the walls I had built around my shattered psyche. On the 3rd day, I finally spoke his name. On the 4th, I managed a few spoonfuls of broth. By the 5th day, I was able to sit up and look at him directly, really seeing him for the first time since our wedding night. He looked exhausted, hollow-eyed with worry and sleeplessness, but his love for me blazed as strong as ever. I'm sorry. I whispered the first coherent sentence I had managed in days. I'm so sorry for what happened, for ruining our wedding, for— Don't! He interrupted firmly, moving from the chair to sit beside me on the bed. Don't you dare apologize for being the victim of a crime. None of this was your fault, Eleanor. None of it. But our wedding day, our honeymoon, everything we planned, we'll have other days, he said, taking my hands in his with infinite gentleness. We'll have a lifetime of days together. What matters is that you're alive, that you're here with me, that we're going to fight this together. That's when he told me about his decision to investigate, to use his skills as a journalist to uncover the truth about Theodore Worthington that the town's social elite refused to acknowledge. There have to be others, he said, his voice taking on the focused intensity I had seen when he worked on important stories. Men like that don't operate in isolation. There will be a pattern, a history, evidence that can't be dismissed or explained away. Well, but who would believe us? I asked, voicing the fear that had been gnawing at me since that terrible night. You saw how they reacted? He's untouchable, James. He's a war hero, a pillar of the community. People would rather believe I'm hysterical than face the truth about what he really is. Then we'll have to give them evidence so compelling they can't ignore it, he replied with quiet determination. We'll start with your family history with records and documents that predate our accusations. If he's done this before, and I'm certain he has, there will be traces. Medical records, unexplained deaths, women who disappeared or were sent away under mysterious circumstances. The mention of family history sparked a memory that made my blood run cold. James, there's something I should tell you. Something about my grandmother's death. The official story was heart failure, but I remember my mother acting strangely around that time. Frightened, almost guilty. And there were whispers among the church ladies' conversations that stopped whenever I entered the room. What kind of whispers? I was only 15, so I didn't understand at the time. But looking back, there were comments about how she had seemed troubled in her final months, how she had been asking strange questions about women's legal rights, about divorce and separation. One of the ladies said she had been asking about women's refugees in other cities, places where wives could go if they needed to escape dangerous situations. James leaned forward, his reporter's instincts clearly engaged. Did she leave any personal papers, a diary, letters, anything that might give us insight into what she was thinking or experiencing? I don't know, I admitted. After she died, Grandpa took care of all her belongings. He said it was too painful for the family to go through her things, so he handled everything himself. But I paused, another memory surfacing from the depths of my childhood trauma. There was one thing. A few months before the wedding, while we were cleaning out some storage areas, my mother found an old cedar chest that had belonged to Grandma. It was locked, and when she saw it, she got very upset. She said it was just old papers and linens, nothing important, but her reaction seemed out of proportion to the discovery. Where is this chest now? In your apartment, actually. My mother gave me the key just before the wedding, said Grandma had wanted me to have it when I married. But she also said, maybe it would be better if I never opened it, that some things were better left buried. James's eyes lit up with the excitement of discovery. Eleanor, that chest could contain exactly what we need. If your grandmother was planning to leave, if she was documenting abuse or seeking help, she might have kept records, evidence, proof of what was happening to her. The possibility that my gentle grandmother had been fighting back, had been trying to expose the monster who masqueraded as her loving husband, filled me with a mixture of hope and devastating sadness. If such evidence existed, it meant she had suffered far more than I had ever imagined. But it also meant that her death might not have been in vain, that the courage she couldn't find in life might still serve to protect other women from Theodore Worthington's predations. We need to get that chest, I said, feeling strength returning to my voice for the first time in days. If there's evidence inside, if there's proof of what he's been doing, we can't let it remain hidden. James nodded, already planning our next move. I'll go to the apartment tonight, bring the chest back here where we can examine it safely. But Eleanor, you need to be prepared for what we might find. If your grandmother was documenting abuse, if she was planning to expose him, the contents of that chest are going to be difficult to read. I understand, I replied, though I wasn't sure I truly grasped the emotional devastation that awaited us. But we have to know the truth. We have to find out how many others he's hurt, how long this has been going on. Not just for justice, but so we know what we're really fighting against. That evening, as James went to retrieve the mysterious chest, I sat alone in our motel room and tried to prepare myself for whatever revelations awaited us. I thought about my grandmother, the gentle woman who had read me stories and taught me to bake cookies, who had always seemed slightly sad despite her loving demeanor. I wondered if her sadness had been the result of secrets too terrible to share, of knowledge too dangerous to voice. Most of all, I wondered if she had somehow known that her granddaughter would one day need the evidence she had been too frightened to use in her own defense. The thought that she might have endured in silence, specifically to protect me from the same fate, filled me with a determination that burned brighter than my fear. When James returned with the cedar chest, I was ready to face whatever truth it contained. The chest was smaller than I remembered from childhood, but its presence in our shabby motel room seemed to fill the entire space with anticipation and dread. James set it carefully on the narrow bed between us, its dark wood and brass fittings gleaming in the lamplight like some ancient artifact that might contain either treasure or curse. "Are you sure you're ready for this?" he asked, studying my face with the concern that had become his constant expression since our wedding night. "We can wait. Take more time if you need it." "No," I said firmly, surprising myself with the strength in my voice. "I've waited long enough. We've both waited long enough. Whatever's in here, whatever my grandmother went through, we need to know." The key turned easily in the old lock, as if it had been waiting all these years for this moment of revelation. The lid opened with a slight creak, releasing the scent of lavender and old paper familiar smells that reminded me of my grandmother's bedroom and the quiet hours I had spent there as a child. On top was a layer of yellowed tissue paper, beneath which lay folded linens and lace, clearly some of my grandmother's most precious possessions, saved for reasons we couldn't yet understand. But as James carefully lifted these items aside, we discovered what lay beneath a leather-bound journal, its pages thick with careful handwriting in my grandmother's distinctive script. "This is it," I breathed, my hands trembling as I lifted the diary from its resting place. "This is what she wanted me to have." The first entries were innocuous enough: weather observations, social calls, notes about my father's childhood milestones and achievements. But as I read deeper into the journal, spanning what appeared to be nearly 20 years of my grandmother's married life, a pattern of horror began to emerge that made my blood run cold. Theodore came to my room again last night. I read aloud, my voice barely above a whisper. I pretended to be asleep, but he knew I was awake. "I don't know how much longer I can endure this. The doctor says I'm with child again, but I fear what kind of father this man will be to any daughter we might have." James listened in grim silence as I continued reading entry after entry, documenting systematic abuse that stretched across decades. My grandmother's words painted a picture of a woman trapped in a nightmare marriage to a man who viewed her as property to be used at his pleasure, who threatened her with social ruin and financial destruction if she ever dared to speak against him. "The worst part isn't what he does to me," I continued, tears streaming down my face as I read. "It's what he says while he does it. He talks about his sister Sarah, about how she learned to accept her place before she was sent away. He talks about the daughter we might have someday, about how he'll train her properly when she's old enough. I pray every night that God will give us only sons, but I fear God isn't listening to the prayers of a woman like me. The journal entries became increasingly desperate as the years passed, documenting my grandmother's failed attempts to seek help from doctors, clergy, and family friends. In the 1930s, there were few resources for women trapped in abusive marriages, and fewer still who would believe accusations against a respected war hero. Every door she approached was firmly closed, every plea for help dismissed as the hysteria of an ungrateful wife. But it was an entry from 1938, when my father was 20 years old, that revealed the full scope of Theodore Worthington's monstrosity. Robert brought his fiancée, Catherine, to meet us today. She's a sweet girl, innocent and trusting, and my heart breaks for what she doesn't know awaits her. After dinner, Theodore insisted on showing her the family portrait gallery, and I saw the way he looked at her the same way he used to look at me, at his sister Sarah, at any woman who comes within his reach. I tried to warn her subtly, to suggest she might want to reconsider this marriage, but how can I explain without destroying my own son's happiness? How can I tell her that the man she thinks will be a loving father-in-law has already made plans for her wedding night? The words hit me like physical blows as I realized the full scope of the family trauma. My mother, my quiet, gentle mother, had been Theodore's victim too, assaulted on her wedding night, just as I had been. The pattern stretched back generations, a cycle of abuse disguised as family tradition, protected by social conventions and masculine authority that made resistance nearly impossible. "There's more," James said quietly, pointing to a loose page that had fallen from the journal. "Look at this." It was a letter written in my grandmother's shaking handwriting and dated just days before her death in 1953. "To whoever finds this record, I have lived with Theodore Worthington's evil for 35 years, too frightened and too isolated to speak the truth that might have saved others. But I cannot take this secret to my grave, not when I see the way he looks at my granddaughter Eleanor. If something happens to me before I can find the courage to expose him, please know that there is one person who knows the truth." Dr. Henry Miller has been treating the injuries Theodore inflicts for decades. He has photographs, medical records, documentation that proves what I have been too weak to report. If Eleanor is ever in danger, if Theodore turns his attention to her, as I fear he will, Dr. Miller is the only person with the evidence needed to stop him. James and I stared at each other across the motel room, the implications of this discovery crashing over us like a wave. We weren't alone in our fight against Theodore Worthington. There was a witness, an ally with medical credentials and documented proof of decades of abuse. Dr. Miller might be retired, might be elderly and frail, but he possessed the evidence we needed to break through the wall of respectability that protected our grandfather. "We have to find him," I said, clutching the letter with hands that shook with excitement and determination. "We have to convince him to come forward to testify about what he knows. It won't be easy." James warned his reporter's instincts, already analyzing the challenges ahead. "He's kept this secret for decades, probably out of fear or professional obligation. It will take something extraordinary to convince him to break his silence now." Then we'll give him something extraordinary," I replied, feeling my grandmother's strength flowing through me across the years. "We'll show him that his silence hasn't protected anyone, that Theodore is still hurting women, still destroying lives, still counting on good people to look the other way while he commits his crimes." As we packed the diary and letter carefully away, I felt a profound connection to my grandmother that transcended death itself. She had endured unspeakable horror, not just to survive, but to ensure that future generations would have the tools to fight back. Her courage, delayed by circumstances, but never truly defeated, would finally serve its intended purpose. The next morning, we began our search for Dr. Henry Miller, knowing that he held the key to bringing Theodore Worthington's reign of terror to an end. Finding Dr. Miller proved easier than we had expected, though what we discovered was heartbreaking in its own way. He was living at Sunset Manor, a nursing home in the nearby town of Millfield, about 30 miles from Harmony Creek. At 87, He was one of the facility's oldest residents, confined to a wheelchair, but still mentally sharp according to the nurses we spoke with. He doesn't get many visitors. The head nurse told us when we explained that we were researching family medical history. His own children live in California, and most of his old patients have passed on or forgotten him. He'll be delighted to have young people to talk with. We found him in the nursing home's sunroom, a frail man wrapped in a blanket despite the warm afternoon, his hands shaking with palsy, but his eyes bright with intelligence. When I introduced myself as Eleanor Worthington Mitchell, I saw recognition dawn in his weathered features, followed immediately by a sadness so profound it was almost painful to witness. Worthington, he repeated slowly, his voice barely above a whisper. Catherine's girl. You have your grandmother's eyes, child. The same shade of blue, the same haunted look she developed over the years. The words sent a chill down my spine, confirming what I had hoped and feared we would find. Dr. Miller knew about Theodore's crimes, had known for decades, and the weight of that knowledge had clearly tormented him through his retirement years. Dr. Miller, I said, gently settling into a chair beside his wheelchair. We need to talk to you about my grandfather, about things that happened to my grandmother and to me. His reaction was immediate and devastating. Tears began streaming down his cheeks as his body shook with suppressed sobs. Oh, child, he whispered, please tell me he didn't. Please tell me I was wrong about what I suspected. You weren't wrong, I said softly, taking his trembling hand in mine. On my wedding night, he drugged me and assaulted me, just like he did to my grandmother, just like he's probably done to others over the years. We need your help to stop him, Dr. Miller. We need the evidence my grandmother said you kept. At first, he was reluctant to speak, mumbling about doctor-patient confidentiality and the dangers of making accusations against powerful men. But when James showed him my grandmother's diary, when we read aloud her letter describing her fear for my safety, his resistance crumbled like a dam bursting under pressure. I should have done something, he said, his voice breaking with decades of suppressed guilt. God forgive me, I should have found a way to stop him years ago. But Theodore Worthington was untouchable war hero town patriarch, respected by everyone who mattered. Who would have believed an old country doctor against such a man? The story he told us was even worse than we had imagined. Over his 40 years of medical practice in Harmony Creek, Dr. Miller had treated a pattern of suspicious injuries in women connected to Theodore Worthington, always explained away as accidents or clumsiness, always accompanied by threats of social and financial ruin if anyone dared to speak the truth. Your grandmother wasn't his first victim, Dr. Miller explained, his voice growing stronger as he unburdened himself of secrets that had tormented him for decades. There was his younger sister, Sarah, who began showing up at my office with injuries when she was barely 14 years old. Bruises in places that couldn't be explained by falls, torn clothing, signs of intimate trauma that no child should have to endure. What happened to her? James asked, though I could see in his expression that he already suspected the answer. The family sent her away to a special school for troubled girls when she was 16. Dr. Miller replied, his hands clenching into fists despite their palsy. Said she was having nervous problems, needed specialized treatment that couldn't be provided at home. I tried to intervene, tried to suggest other solutions, but the Worthington influence was too powerful. She died at that place 2 years later, officially from consumption, though I always suspected, well, it doesn't matter now. She's been gone 50 years. The pattern became clear as Dr. Miller continued his account. Theodore had been preying on vulnerable women his entire adult life, using his position and reputation to silence his victims and cover his tracks. My grandmother's marriage to him hadn't been a love match, as family stories claimed, but rather an arrangement that delivered a new victim directly into his hands while enhancing his social standing. I kept records, Dr. Miller said quietly, his voice dropping to barely audible levels. Photographs of injuries detailed medical notes documentation that couldn't be dismissed as hysteria or accident. Your grandmother begged me to preserve the evidence, said that someday it might be needed to protect others. I never destroyed those files, though perhaps I should have. Where are they now? I asked, my heart pounding with the possibility that we might finally have the proof needed to bring Theodore to justice. In a safety deposit box at First National Bank in Millfield, he replied. Along with a written account of everything I witnessed over the years, sworn statements from nurses who assisted me, copies of police reports that were filed and then mysteriously lost. I've been carrying this burden for 30 years, waiting for someone to ask the right questions. James and I exchanged glances, hardly daring to believe that we had found not just an ally, but a witness with documented evidence spanning decades of Theodore's crimes. This was more than we had hoped for, concrete medical proof that couldn't be dismissed as family gossip or hysterical accusations. Will you help us? I asked, squeezing Dr. Miller's hand gently. Will you come forward and testify about what you know? He was quiet for a long moment, staring out the sunroom windows at the peaceful gardens beyond. When he finally spoke, his voice carried the weight of a decision that had been years in the making. I'm dying, child, he said simply. Cancer. The doctors give me perhaps 3 months. I can't take this secret to my grave, won't take it to my grave. If there's a chance to stop him, to prevent him from hurting anyone else, then yes, I'll testify. I'll give you everything I have. The relief that flooded through me was almost overwhelming. After days of feeling helpless and alone, we had found an ally with the credentials and evidence to challenge Theodore's reputation. But more than that, we had found validation for my grandmother's suffering, proof that her courage in documenting Theodore's crimes had not been in vain. There's something else you need to know. Dr. Miller continued, his expression growing even more grave. About your father, Eleanor, about his wedding night. The words hung in the air like a physical presence, heavy with implication. I felt James's hand tighten around mine as we waited for the revelation that would complete our understanding of the Worthington family's dark legacy. Your mother came to see me the morning after her wedding in 1938. Dr. Miller said, his eyes distant with painful memory. Beaten, traumatized, barely able to speak coherently. She told me what had happened, how Theodore had assaulted her while your father was passed out from drinking, how he had convinced her that it was somehow her fault, that she had tempted him beyond his control. The room seemed to spin around me as the implications became clear. My mother, my gentle, submissive mother, had been Theodore's victim before I was even born. The pattern of abuse stretched back even further than I had imagined, encompassing not just generations of direct victims, but the collateral damage inflicted on their families. Your father knew, Dr. Miller continued, his voice heavy with sadness. He found them together the next morning, saw enough to understand what had happened. But Theodore convinced him that speaking out would destroy the family, ruin their reputation, send them all into social and financial exile. Robert was 22 years old, raised by that monster, taught that women were property to be protected or punished as men saw fit. He chose silence over justice, and that choice has shaped every decision he's made since. It didn't excuse my father's behavior, his willingness to sacrifice his daughter to protect his father's reputation. But it explained it in a way that was almost more heartbreaking than simple cowardice. My father wasn't just Theodore's son, he was another one of his victims, psychologically manipulated and emotionally crippled by decades of gaslighting and abuse. As we prepared to leave the nursing home carrying Dr. Miller's promise to testify and the location of evidence that could finally bring Theodore Worthington to justice, I felt my grandmother's presence like a warm embrace. She had planted the seeds of his destruction decades ago, preserving evidence and cultivating witnesses, leaving a trail of breadcrumbs for someone brave enough to follow. The war hero's carefully constructed facade was about to crumble, and this time there would be no social standing or community respect powerful enough to protect him from the consequences of his crimes. The confrontation we planned was surgical in its precision and devastating in its impact. James spent 3 days coordinating with Dr. Miller, Sheriff Morrison, and a prosecutor from the county seat, who specialized in cases involving prominent citizens and sensitive evidence. Every detail was carefully orchestrated to prevent Theodore from escaping justice through social pressure or legal technicalities. The setting was perfect in its irony: another dinner party at the Worthington house on Elm Street, another gathering of Harmony Creek's social elite designed to demonstrate the family's continued respectability and influence. My father had organized the event as a show of strength following the unfortunate incident at my wedding reception, inviting the mayor, bank board members, prominent business owners, and their wives to enjoy my mother's famous pot roast and Theodore's wartime stories. The Worthington family remains strong and united. My father had declared in his invitation, clearly intended as a rebuke to anyone who might have given credence to the hysterical accusations made by his daughter and son-in-law. We look forward to celebrating our continued commitment to Harmony Creek's values and traditions. They had no idea that James had spent the week making copies of every document Dr. Miller had preserved, every photograph and medical record and sworn statement accumulated over 30 years of careful documentation. They didn't know that the prosecutor had already reviewed the evidence and determined it was sufficient to bring formal charges. Most importantly, they didn't know that Dr. Miller himself had agreed to attend the dinner, arriving in an ambulance if necessary, to confront the man whose crimes he had been documenting for decades. The dining room was elegant as always, the mahogany table gleaming under crystal chandeliers set with the finest china and silver that had been in the Worthington family for generations. My father presided from the head of the table like a king holding court, while Theodore occupied his traditional place of honor at his son's right hand. The conversation was light and pleasant: business ventures, social events, harmless gossip about neighbors and acquaintances. My absence was explained as the new bride adjusting to married life, a euphemism that drew knowing smiles from the married women present and satisfied the curiosity of those who had witnessed my breakdown at the wedding reception. No one questioned why the young Mrs. Mitchell wasn't present to receive their congratulations and well wishes. Sheriff Morrison arrived at precisely 8 o'clock, just as the main course was being served. His presence was unexpected, but not alarming. He had been invited to many Worthington gatherings over the years, and his appearance suggested nothing more than a social call or perhaps discussion of some minor municipal matter. "Evening, folks," he said, his tone carefully neutral as he surveyed the assembled guests. "Sorry to interrupt your dinner, but I have some official business that can't wait." The temperature in the room seemed to drop several degrees as the guests realized this wasn't a social visit. Conversations died mid-sentence, forks paused halfway to mouths, and all eyes turned toward Theodore Worthington with varying degrees of confusion and concern. That's when Dr. Miller entered the dining room, supported by a nurse, but walking under his own power, with a dignity that commanded immediate attention. The old physician's presence was shocking. Most people hadn't seen him in years, and his appearance at a Worthington family dinner raised questions that no one quite dared to ask aloud. "Theodore," Dr. Miller said, his voice carrying clearly through the stunned silence. "We need to talk about your sister Sarah, about what you did to your wife, about what you did to Eleanor on her wedding night." The silence that followed was deafening, broken only by the soft sound of Mrs. Patterson dropping her water glass, which shattered against her dinner plate with a sound like breaking crystal. Theodore's face went through a rapid succession of expressions: shock, fear, calculation, and then a cold rage that I recognized from my own traumatic encounter with him. Henry," Theodore said carefully, his voice controlled but with an edge of warning. "You're obviously not well. Perhaps you should return to the nursing home and rest. This is neither the time nor the place for whatever delusions you're experiencing." But Dr. Miller was beyond intimidation, now strengthened by the knowledge that he had nothing left to lose and everything to gain by finally speaking the truth. He reached into his coat pocket and withdrew a manila envelope thick with documents and photographs. that represented 3 decades of carefully preserved evidence. "I have medical records, Theodore," he said, his voice growing stronger with each word. "Photographs of injuries that could only have been inflicted by deliberate violence. Sworn statements from nurses who assisted me in treating your victims. Police reports that were filed and then mysteriously buried through your influence and connections." The dinner guests sat frozen in horror as the carefully maintained facade of respectability began to crumble before their eyes. This wasn't some hysterical accusation from an overwrought young bride. This was a respected physician, presenting evidence accumulated over decades of careful observation and documentation. Sheriff Morrison stepped forward, his hand resting on the handcuffs at his belt. "Theodore Worthington, you're under arrest for the sexual assault of Eleanor Mitchell and multiple charges of assault and battery dating back over 30 years. Instead of denial or outrage, instead of the shocked innocence that might have been expected from a falsely accused man, Theodore Worthington smiled. It was the same cold, calculating expression I had seen in the country club library, the look of a predator who believed himself beyond the reach of justice, even when confronted with overwhelming evidence. "You're all fools," he said, his voice carrying the arrogance of 7 decades of unchallenged power and privilege. "Do you really think I've been careless? Do you think I haven't planned for this possibility? Eleanor is a disturbed young woman prone to hysteria and delusions. Dr. Miller is a senile old man desperate for attention before he dies. And my son?" He looked directly at my father with undisguised contempt. "My son is a weakling who will say anything to avoid confronting uncomfortable truths." The mask was finally slipping completely away, revealing the monster that had hidden behind respectability and social standing for so long. The dinner guests stared in shocked silence as their host transformed before their eyes, from beloved war hero to calculating predator who viewed their horror as nothing more than inconvenience. "You want the truth?" Theodore continued, rising from his chair with the dignity of a man who believed he had already won the game. "The truth is that women exist for the pleasure and convenience of men. I took what was mine by right, what any man in this room would take if they had the courage to claim it." Sheriff Morrison moved to arrest him, but Theodore wasn't finished with his confessions. Years of carefully hidden crimes poured out of him like poison from a burst abscess, decades of systematic abuse, spoken aloud with the pride of a man describing his greatest achievements. "My sister Sarah understood her place eventually," he said, his voice taking on a dreamy, nostalgic quality that made my blood run cold. "Sweet little Sarah. She fought at first, but she learned. They all learn given proper instruction. My wife learned. Eleanor was learning too, until this fool of a husband interfered with her education." The confession was more complete and damning than anything we could have hoped for, delivered in front of witnesses who could never again claim ignorance or disbelief. But the effort of maintaining his facade for so many years, combined with the stress of exposure and the rage of being challenged, proved too much for Theodore's aged system to handle. Mid-sentence describing in graphic detail what he had done to my grandmother on their wedding night 57 years before. Theodore Worthington's eyes rolled back in his head, and he collapsed to the Persian rug, his body convulsing as a massive stroke destroyed the brain that had conceived such elaborate evil. Dr. Miller, despite his own frailty, was immediately at Theodore's side, checking for vital signs with professional efficiency, even as the man who had been his patient and tormentor lay dying before him. "Call an ambulance," he instructed Sheriff Morrison, though his tone suggested it might already be too late. As paramedics worked over Theodore's unconscious form, and the dinner guests sat in stunned silence, processing what they had witnessed, I felt a strange sense of cosmic justice. The monster who had destroyed so many lives would survive, but as a prisoner in his own body, unable to speak or move or hurt anyone ever again. It seemed a fitting punishment for a man who had robbed others of their voices and their freedom. The war hero's reign of terror was finally over-ended, not by a heroic battle, but by the quiet courage of his victims and the patient documentation of a country doctor who had never forgotten his oath to do no harm. The aftermath of that dinner party reverberated through Harmony Creek like an earthquake, shattering the foundations of everything the community thought it knew about honor, respectability, and the men they had chosen to revere. Within hours, news of Theodore Worthington's confession and collapse had spread throughout the town, carried by the traumatized dinner guests who had witnessed his mask finally slip away completely. The reaction was swift and merciless. The Harmony Creek Gazette, under James's guidance, published a special edition documenting the full scope of Theodore's crimes, complete with excerpts from Dr. Miller's medical records and my grandmother's diary. The evidence was so overwhelming, the pattern so clear and undeniable, that even Theodore's most devoted supporters found it impossible to maintain their faith in his innocence. My father's response was perhaps the most heartbreaking aspect of the entire ordeal. Instead of relief that his family's dark secret could finally be healed, instead of gratitude that future victims would be protected, he was consumed by rage and humiliation at the public exposure of sins he had spent decades helping to conceal. "You've destroyed everything," he screamed at James when we finally confronted him in his study, surrounded by the portraits of Worthington ancestors, who had somehow failed to prevent the monster in their midst. 50 years of building our reputation in this community, and you've torn it down in a single evening. We'll never recover from this scandal, but it was my mother's transformation that proved most remarkable. For the first time in my memory, Catherine Worthington found her voice standing up to her husband with a strength and clarity that shocked everyone present. "Recover?" she said, her tone incredulous as she faced the man she had been married to for 17 years. "Robert, your father attacked our daughter on her wedding night. He assaulted me on ours. He destroyed your Aunt Sarah when she was barely more than a child. How dare you talk about scandal and reputation when innocent people were suffering?" The argument that followed was vicious, and decades in the making, years of suppressed resentment and buried trauma, erupting in a torrent of accusations and revelations. My father blamed my mother for tempting Theodore, for not fighting harder, for not warning me of the danger, despite her own traumatic history. My mother fired back with the full fury of a woman who had been silenced for too long, detailing years of emotional manipulation and threats that had kept her trapped in a marriage built on lies and fear. By morning, their marriage was effectively over. My mother packed her belongings and left the house on Elm Street forever, coming to James and me with nothing but the clothes on her back and a freedom she hadn't experienced since her wedding day in 1938. She moved into a small apartment above the dress shop where she found work, finally able to speak openly about her experiences and begin the long process of healing from decades of suppressed trauma. The town's reaction was complex and painful to witness. The older generation, particularly those who had known and served with Theodore during the war, struggled to reconcile the hero they had revered with the monster he had been revealed to be. Some refused to accept the evidence, even when confronted with irrefutable proof, preferring to believe in an elaborate conspiracy rather than face the uncomfortable truth about their golden boy. But others, especially women, who had their own hidden stories of inappropriate behavior and whispered warnings, came forward with accounts that filled in the gaps in Theodore's history of predation. The pattern became impossible to ignore. He had been systematically abusing women for over 50 years, protected by his war hero status and the community's unwillingness to look too closely at their most celebrated citizen. Dr. Miller became an unlikely hero. In the aftermath, his courage in finally speaking out, inspiring others to break their own silences about abuse and violence they had witnessed or experienced. Though his cancer was advancing rapidly, he spent his remaining months giving interviews to journalists and law enforcement officials, ensuring that Theodore's complete history would be documented for posterity. Theodore himself never regained consciousness or the ability to speak after his massive stroke. He was transferred to a state facility for the criminally insane, where he would spend his remaining years as a prisoner in his own broken body, alive, but unable to communicate, to manipulate, or to harm anyone ever again. The doctors said he was aware of his surroundings, but completely paralyzed, trapped in a hell of his own making, with full knowledge of what he had lost. James and I left Harmony Creek 2 months after that confrontation, driving away in our honeymoon car toward a new life in Chicago, where the Worthington name carried no weight and our story was unknown. We had originally planned to settle closer to home, but the events surrounding our wedding had made it impossible to remain in a community where we would forever be defined by Theodore's crimes and their aftermath. The transition wasn't easy. There were nights when I woke screaming, reliving the horror of that library encounter. There were days when James struggled with guilt over not protecting me, when he questioned whether he should have recognized the signs of danger that seemed so obvious in hindsight. There were moments when we both wondered whether our marriage could survive the trauma that had marked its beginning. But love, we discovered, was stronger than the evil that had tried to destroy it. Our bond, forged in the fires of that terrible experience, became the foundation upon which we built a life dedicated to truth, justice, and the protection of others who found themselves facing similar battles against powerful predators. Chicago, in 1955, was a city of opportunity and anonymity, perfect for a young couple seeking to rebuild their lives away from the shadows of family scandal. James found work with the Tribune, starting as a junior reporter, but quickly proving his worth with investigations that exposed corruption and gave voice to the powerless. I took a position at Hull House, working with immigrant women and children who had survived their own traumas and needed advocates who understood the complexities of healing from systematic abuse. The work was difficult, but deeply rewarding. Every woman I helped find safe housing, every child I protected from violence, every family I assisted in navigating the legal system represented a victory against the forces that had tried to destroy me. My own experience, as horrific as it had been, gave me credibility and insight that no amount of training could have provided. We lived modestly in a small apartment near the lake, far from the grand houses and social pretensions that had defined our lives in Harmony Creek. Our neighbors were teachers and shop owners, immigrants and artists, people who valued character over pedigree and judged us by our actions rather than our family names. For the first time in my life, I felt free to be myself, rather than some idealized version of what a Worthington woman should be. The healing process was slow and sometimes painful. There were setbacks and dark days when the trauma seemed overwhelming, when physical intimacy felt impossible, and trust seemed like a luxury we couldn't afford. But James never wavered in his patience and support, understanding that recovery couldn't be rushed, and that love sometimes meant simply holding space for pain without trying to fix it. Our first child, a daughter we named Hope, was born in 1957. I had worried throughout the pregnancy that motherhood would trigger memories of my own childhood trauma, but instead, it provided a new purpose and clarity about the importance of breaking cycles of abuse. Hope would grow up knowing she was wanted and protected, that her voice mattered, and her body belonged only to her. We had 2 more children over the following years, another daughter, Grace, and a son, David, each one adding joy and meaning to our lives while healing wounds we hadn't even realized we carried. I told them age-appropriate versions of our family history as they grew older. Not the brutal details, but the essential truth that some people in the world would try to hurt them, and that silence in the face of evil was a form of complicity. My mother remained an integral part of our new life, blossoming into the woman she had always been beneath the frightened facade she had worn for so many years. Free from my father's control and the suffocating expectations of Harmony Creek society, she discovered talents and interests that had been suppressed for decades. She helped raise our children, found meaningful work, and eventually even began dating again, a kind widower who treated her with the respect and gentleness she had never known in her marriage. Letters from Harmony Creek arrived sporadically, usually forwarded through James's former colleagues at the local newspaper. My father had become a recluse after the scandal, rarely leaving his house, and growing increasingly bitter and isolated as former friends and business associates distanced themselves from the Worthington name. His bank failed within 2 years as clients avoided any association with Theodore's legacy, and he was forced to sell the family home to pay his debts. Dr. Miller died in 1958, 3 years after his courageous testimony brought Theodore's crimes to light. His funeral was attended by dozens of women whose stories had finally been believed thanks to his willingness to break his silence. In his final interview with James, published posthumously in the Tribune, he expressed no regret about his decision to come forward despite the personal cost. "A doctor's first duty is to do no harm." He had said, his voice weak but his conviction strong. "For 30 years I failed in that duty by remaining silent about Theodore Worthington's crimes. My only regret is that I didn't find the courage sooner to speak for those who couldn't speak for themselves." Theodore himself died in 1961, 6 years after his stroke, having never regained the ability to speak or move. His death was noted briefly in the Harmony Creek Gazette, a simple obituary that mentioned his military service, but carefully avoided any reference to his later exposure as a predator. There were no mourners at his funeral, except a few elderly veterans who remembered only the hero he had once appeared to be. My father followed him to the grave 2 years later alone in the house on Elm Street where so much suffering had been concealed behind elegant furnishings and social propriety. The coroner ruled it a heart attack, but those who knew him suspected it was really a broken spirit that killed him, the inability to live with the knowledge of what he had enabled and covered up for so many years. The house was sold to strangers who had no knowledge of its dark history, eventually torn down and replaced by a small park where children now play on swings and slides. Sometimes I think that transformation is fitting new life, growing where so much pain had been hidden, innocent laughter echoing in a place that had known too much silence and secrecy. As I write these words in 1985, 30 years after that terrible wedding night that changed the course of my life, I am surrounded by evidence that love and justice ultimately triumph over evil and silence. Our children have grown into adults who understand the importance of speaking truth to power, who work in their own ways to protect the vulnerable and expose those who would exploit them. Hope became a lawyer specializing in women's rights, inspired by her mother's story, to ensure that future victims have legal resources and protections that weren't available in my grandmother's time. Grace followed in her father's footsteps as an investigative journalist, using her skills to expose corruption and give voice to those who have been silenced by power and privilege. David became a doctor, like Dr. Miller, committed to healing both physical and emotional wounds while maintaining the highest ethical standards. James retired from the Tribune last year after a distinguished career that included a Pulitzer Prize for his investigation into police corruption and organized crime. His series on systematic abuse in positions of authority, inspired by our own experiences with Theodore, helped change laws and policies that had previously protected predators at the expense of their victims. We now live quietly by the lake, watching sunsets over the water and playing with our grandchildren, who will grow up in a world where women's voices carry weight and survivors are believed rather than silenced. My mother lived to see her great-grandchildren passing peacefully in her sleep in 1982, at the age of 84. In her final years, she often spoke of my grandmother, of the courage it had taken to document Theodore's crimes, even when she lacked the power to expose them. "She saved you," my mother would say, even though she couldn't save herself. That's what love does. It reaches across time to protect the people we care about most. The final piece of the puzzle came just last year, when renovation work on the old Worthington property uncovered a hidden room beneath the basement foundation. Inside were dozens of photographs, documents, and personal items that had belonged to Theodore's sister Sarah, proof that she hadn't died of consumption at that distant school, but had been murdered when she threatened to expose her brother's crimes against her and other young women. The discovery made national news, prompting law enforcement agencies across the country to reopen cold cases involving missing women from the 1920s and 1930s. Theodore Worthington's true scope of evil may never be fully known, but at least Sarah finally has a voice, finally has justice, even if it came decades too late. I testified at the renewed investigation, now a 68-year-old woman, telling the story of an 18-year-old bride's nightmare. The detective handling the case was a woman, something that would have been impossible in my grandmother's time, and she listened with the respect and attention that every survivor deserves, taking careful notes and asking gentle questions that showed she understood the courage it takes to speak such truths aloud. As I walked out of that courthouse, clutching my grandmother's ring and feeling the weight of all the women who had suffered in silence, I realized something profound about the story that began with violence and betrayal, but became something entirely different, a testament to the power of truth, the strength of survivors, and the unbreakable bonds between women who refuse to let evil have the final word. Theodore Worthington believed that power and privilege made him untouchable, that social conventions and masculine authority would protect him from the consequences of his crimes. He thought he was continuing a tradition of dominance and control that stretched back generations, that his victims would remain silent out of shame and fear, just as they always had. But he made one crucial miscalculation. He chose to assault a woman who was married to a man with the skills and determination to investigate, to dig for truth, to refuse to accept official stories when they contradicted the evidence. And he attacked a granddaughter whose grandmother had spent decades carefully preserving the evidence that would ultimately destroy him. The monster, who thought he was claiming another victim, instead created his own destruction. He thought he was perpetuating a cycle of abuse, but instead he forced its end. He believed his power made him invincible, but instead he sealed his own fate and ensured that future generations would be protected from his legacy of violence. That is my victory, and it is complete. Not just for me, but for my grandmother, who planted the seeds of justice even when she couldn't live to see them bloom. For Dr. Miller, who found the courage to speak truth to power in his final years. For my mother, who finally broke free from the silence that had imprisoned her for decades. For all the women whose voices were silenced, but whose spirits remained unbroken, whose suffering was not in vain because it ultimately led to exposure and justice. As I watch my granddaughters play in the garden outside our Chicago home, laughing freely, speaking their minds without fear, growing up in a world where their safety and dignity are protected rather than negotiated, I know that the best revenge against evil is the life lived fully in spite of it. Theodore Worthington tried to destroy me on what should have been the happiest day of my life. Instead, he gave me a purpose that has defined and driven me for 3 decades of meaningful work protecting others from predators like himself. The songbird he tried to silence found her voice and used it to sing the song of justice that has echoed through the years, inspiring others to speak their own truths and create their own victories against the forces that would silence them. The darkness he represented has been driven back by the light of truth, and that light continues to shine through the lives of every person who refuses to be silenced, every survivor who finds the strength to speak, every community that chooses justice over reputation and protection of the vulnerable, over preservation of the powerful. That is the true ending of this story, not with my wedding day trauma, but with the lifetime of healing and advocacy that grew from it. Not with Theodore's crimes, but with the justice that finally brought them to light. Not with the silence that protected him, but with the voices that ultimately exposed him and ensured that his evil would die with him rather than pass to another generation. The songbird sings still, and her song is one of victory.